to take on America directly is not something they're capable of doing. If, however, they develop militias all around the region, that they play what is known in the game as asymmetrical warfare, instead of just straight armies in uniforms from a country fighting other country armies in uniforms, you have a much more unofficial, blended, less easy to quantify and to mitigate threat.
How dangerous are the times we're living in, with nations being encouraged to enlarge their military capabilities, talk of conscription, and warnings of a world war in a mere 2 or 3 years? The head of the Norwegian Armed Forces, Eirik Kristoffersen, has predicted that the West has 2, maybe 3 years to prepare for war with Russia. And the tinderbox of the Middle East just got a lot sparkier after 3 American army soldiers were killed with 30 other service members injured in a drone attack on a small US outpost in Jordan. President Biden has vowed there'll be a response, and our own Prime Minister has also expressed his concern in the past few hours, calling on Iran to de-escalate. So how concerned should we all be? Let's speak to Hagai Segal, a professor in Middle East Studies and a geopolitical analyst from New York University in London. Welcome to the program, Hagai.
Thanks,
I guess,
Mariana.
first of all, the last thing anyone wants to be doing is sort of escalating people's sense of fear and worry. But these do feel like extremely dangerous times. And it just feels like, week on week, day on day, there are further incendiary moments occurring. What's your broad view?
Look, I think it's a very real debate, but I also think there's a value in the debate, that the debate itself can serve in ways of ensuring that that eventuality doesn't happen. If you look at what led to World War II, where, for example, with the fascist rise in Spain during the Spanish Civil War, and democratic countries like Britain actually acted to stop the arming of the democratic government at the time because they were desperately trying to avoid a war. But Hitler basically used it as a testing ground for tactics he later used in Poland, for example. There was such a fear of a conflict that a rising extremist was allowed to develop an enormous military capability that he then used to launch a world war. What is, I think, so different today is that we are individually, collectively, at government levels, acutely aware of that history. And if you look, for example, at the response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, what was done by European countries, by NATO countries, very acutely aware of that history, was to say, we're not going to watch as this happens. And, Putin's calculus, for example, into going into Ukraine was that the West was divided, that Brexit, that the rise of Trump showed that there wouldn't be a united response. And yet what he actually did was reinforce the post-Second World War consensus. And the good news is, and there is a lot to worry about, but the good news is that in many ways, the post-Second World War consensus, global and also European institutions that were put in exactly to make sure that we don't casually domino effect into World War as we did in World War I and World War II, are under strain, but they're largely holding. We have the European Union, but remember, we also have 2 other Europes, the Council of Europe, the OSCE, and these are all intergovernmental clubs which are designed to stop these things taking place.
But you say that they're broadly holding. Of course, when Israel declared war on Hamas following the terrorist attack on October the 7th, there was concern that the entire Middle East could be destabilized. And it does feel that incrementally we are moving toward, it might not have happened overnight as we expected, but it feels like there's a real and present danger from Iran at the moment. Iran is saying they're not directly responsible, but the militias that they are, loyal, or militias that are loyal to Iran are responsible for it. So there is a sense that they're sparking little fires everywhere.
Yes, but the interesting thing that we have to assess carefully is, how does that relate to your previous question? Does a conflict between Iran and one of its neighbors or with the United States result in a world war? And I think what is important to understand about a lot of what's going on in Iran is that what we're seeing is actually not about states going to war with each other. The current strategic situation where you described, and you've described it very accurately, that what we have is a group of militias that Iran has armed around the region, was specifically in response to 20 odd years ago, the US invasion of Iraq. And what Iran very quickly did was say, how do we make sure we're not the next country to face regime change? And what they realized was that to take on America directly is not something they're capable of doing. If, however, they develop militias all around the region, that they play what is known in the game as asymmetrical warfare, instead of just straight armies in uniforms from a country fighting other country armies in uniforms, you have a much more unofficial, blended, less easy to quantify and to mitigate threat. And this means that if, for example, America at the moment decided to want to do something about Iran, it has to take into account the fact that it has militias associated with it in Lebanon and in Iraq and in Syria and in Yemen and in Gaza, etc. Now, the bad news about that, of course, it makes it a very messy and complicated situation to easily resolve. But the good news, going back to your original question, is that this is not hundreds of thousands of soldiers from armies and tanks rolling across borders and fighting with each other. Now, this poses very different and complex challenges to the international world order. But what largely we're seeing in the world, and of course the big exception is Russia and Ukraine, is that we're seeing this asymmetrical warfare. It's governments fighting against non-government actors. Now, they're funded by governments. Hamas attack has Iranian footprints and fingerprints all over it, as does what's going on with Yemen. And I think what America and the West are trying to do with the response to the Houthi attacks, what we're seeing at the moment in Iraq, is and we had this today from the Iranians saying, we're not behind the decision making of resistance groups. They're trying to send a very clear message that unless Iran directly gets involved with the people who they are arming and funding, and who are carrying out these attacks and stop them, that eventually something will have to be done against them directly. And
But what
the
about?
interesting thing with this is,
Mm,
sorry.
Well, I was just going to say, but I mean, I don't want to bring back terms from the past that we've long buried, but what about the sort of axis of evil that's been connected between Russia and Iran? Because Iran, on their own, absolutely everything you say is totally correct. But when you add it to this sense that there's a new world order, a new division being created, on which Russia and Iran seem to be very firmly in cahoots, then that becomes surely increasingly worrying.
It does. And by the way, I don't want to further depress your listeners, but we need to watch very carefully what's going on with North Korea. The South Koreans are very worried that in this current environment, the North are thinking about carrying out an attack, and in fact, they're worried that they want to carry out a Hamas-style attack. North Korean weaponry, the Israelis claim, was found with Hamas. So yeah, there are these interlinking dynamics, but I go back to a point I made earlier. In many ways, the Russian intervention in Ukraine was an act of weakness. It was Russia that feels it has kind of been relegated to a relatively medium, if not small, actor in global affairs, trying to assert influence in the very few places it still has left, as in many ways what is developing in the world is a US-China strategic contest. And again, Iran, what it's doing at the moment is in many ways a sign of weakness. A lot of this action through its proxies is in many ways trying to avoid direct conflicts, but look to its supporters and look to its people that it is doing something. And one of the things
And
we also have to consider is Iran may well be undermining its own domestic stability with this. This is an astonishingly unpopular regime. And we've seen frequently in recent months that when they've tried to do very public statements supporting the Palestinians, that actually anti-regime protesters have tried to disrupt them and stop them, not because they are overtly anti-Palestinian, but they don't do anything that is seen as supporting the government. And Iran sucking the region into a regional conflict may actually result in Iranians saying we cannot have this government anymore, and having even more protests. So don't forget that Iran is also dealing with an incredibly tense and cautious domestic environment, and it has to be very, very careful. Also, by the way, in Lebanon, one of the reasons why Iran and Hezbollah are attacking Israel only on the border, but as yet have not done any more, is Iran knows full well that if Lebanon collapses as a consequence of conflict that it and Hezbollah are seen as starting, that may result in the next Lebanon becoming one that's pro-Western, aligned with the Americans, the Saudis, moving away from Iran. And that's a huge threat to it. So this is a risky environment, but also don't forget that it's complex for them as well as for us.
Just very briefly, because I'm afraid we're running out of time. Could you just give me an idea then, in light of everything you've said, and it's really great to have your, clear knowledge on this. I mean, you've previously taken part in Israeli-Palestinian peace talks and so on. The what's happened in Jordan is obviously connected to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict at the moment. The US has vowed to respond to it. What should they do? Are you concerned that it could, exacerbate the situation?
Yeah, and it's a huge strategic quandary because don't forget that Biden's problem is this is all it's a direct strategic threat, but it's also all auditioning for the next U.S. election. And Donald Trump set a standard which the Republicans are now ramming down Biden's throat. That 2 years ago he took out Iran's general that is in charge of all of this. And remember, they killed him in Iraq as he was there coordinating these very militias that have now are carrying out these attacks. And so what Trump is doing, waiting in the wings to challenge Biden and the Republican Party doing is saying, well, this wouldn't have happened in our watch. Now that is, I think we have to take within an enormous bucket of salt. But the bottom line is that Biden has to be well aware that his response is going to be seen as essential to the US voters' judgments on his capacity as the commander in chief who's seeking re-election.
So those are quite conflicting influences in a way. Listen, Hagai Segal, really, really enjoyed talking to you. Very much hope you'll come back on the program again. We really value this sort of expertise on our show. I wish I could say I felt reassured after talking to you, but that would be an exaggeration. Hagai Segal, thanks again for joining us.